All right, let's jump right in. We've got some reports here, pretty intense stuff going on in the region, and well, we're going to try to help you understand it all.
Yeah.
We're talking about potential ceasefires, big moves on the ground, maybe even a surprise or two along the way.
It is a lot to unpack for sure.
It is.
Let's maybe start with the Kursk region. That seems to be where a lot of the action is happening.
Yeah, okay, so the reports are mentioning that Russian forces have taken back control of a couple locations, Zelishenka and Rybonchina.
Right near Sutsa.
Yeah, and this is interesting because these areas were under the control of opposing forces for quite a while.
Right. They advanced last summer and took those locations. So this is a pretty big shift.
It is a big shift.
And you know what makes it even more interesting is this is all happening while the White House and the Kremlin are supposedly, talking about a ceasefire, trying to end this whole thing, this 3-year conflict.
It's like two completely different things going on at the same time, right? You have these high-level talks about peace, and then on the ground, there are these intense battles still raging.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that we haven't heard anything officially from the opposing side about these territorial shifts.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, so then you have President Putin calling for those opposing forces in the region to just lay down their arms, surrender, and saying that he'll spare their lives if they do.
And then President Trump is echoing those sentiments on Truth Social, even going so far as to say that those forces are surrounded.
However, commanders representing the opposing side are pushing back hard, saying absolutely not, no encirclement at all, calling these claims completely fabricated.
Right. And the Kremlin, through their spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, has doubled down on Putin's demand, saying it's still on the table, but they need to act fast. So you can really see how the rhetoric is heating up, even as these ceasefire talks are, supposedly progressing.
Yeah, it's not just talk either. It seems like actions are escalating as well. Despite all this talk about a ceasefire, the reports mention Russia launching 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and 178 drones in a number of cities.
And one of those strikes, unfortunately, hit a residential area in Kryvyi Rih, that's Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown, and 14 people were injured, including 2 children.
It's important to say, though, that Russia maintains that they do not target areas with non-combatants.
Absolutely got to look at all sides of this and recognize how complex this conflict is.
Yeah.
So, maybe shifting our focus a bit to the battle for Kursk specifically, it's become one of the most fiercely contested areas.
It has.
As Russia really tries to push opposing forces out of that region.
And this push, of course, is happening at the same time as those ceasefire negotiations, which just makes things even more confusing. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
It really is. And because of this constantly evolving front line, you've got the international community responding. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer organized a virtual summit with leaders from other nations that are committed to providing more assistance to Ukraine.
Right. And that brings up a really important point from the reports. There was a temporary halt in assistance, both military and intelligence, for the U.S. to Ukraine last week.
Yes. And it seems like Russia took advantage of that pause. They really stepped up their efforts to take back parts of the Kursk region. We saw a surge in attacks both within the region itself and along the border with the Sumy region.
Okay, so how has Russia been carrying out this offensive? What tactics are they using?
Well, it's kind of a multifaceted approach. They're sending small groups focused on disruption into the opposing side's territory and combining that with increased shelling along the border and targeted attacks on Sumy, the regional center.
And the reports are really painting a stark picture here. They say there were 161 explosions recorded in the Sumy region just overnight. There are also reports of Shahed drones being used to target key infrastructure in Sumy, causing power outages, disruptions to the water supply.
Right. And Andriy Demchenko, a representative from the State Border Guard Service, has provided some insights into the situation. He said that small, highly mobile Russian units did try to cross the northern border, but they were pushed back. According to Demchenko, their goal was to break through the lines and establish a fortified presence, but so far, they haven't been successful.
Yeah, Demchenko also said that Russian forces initially used armored vehicles and all-terrain vehicles to try to breach the border, but those attempts failed.
Interesting.
So more recently, they've switched tactics. They're resorting to these small disruptive groups of up to 5 soldiers.
That's a really interesting tactical shift. It seems to suggest that they're adapting their approach based on the resistance they're encountering.
Yeah, adjusting their strategy on the fly.
Yeah.
And in addition to all of this, Russian engineer units have started demining operations in the parts of the Kursk region they've retaken near the border.
Yes, another piece of this puzzle.
A lot to process.
It is. It really makes you wonder how serious these ceasefire talks really are.
Yeah, you have to be skeptical when you see these attacks happening at the same time as these peace discussions. It just doesn't add up.
It really doesn't. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a conflict playing out on a battlefield. There's a whole information war going on, too, with each side trying to win over international support, trying to control the narrative.
And speaking of the international community, it looks like they're becoming more and more involved. That virtual summit, organized by the UK Prime Minister, shows a real effort to coordinate support for Ukraine.
Right, and that's really significant because we saw what happened last week when aid from the U.S. was paused, even temporarily. Russia took advantage of that. It really shows how much influence outside powers have on what happens on the ground.
It's a delicate balance. The level of international involvement seems to directly impact the intensity of the conflict, but we also can't forget what's happening within Russia and Ukraine themselves.
Absolutely. The political landscape within each country is just as important. You have Putin, who is under a lot of pressure to appear strong, and then you have Zelensky, who's trying to rally his nation and maintain that crucial international support.
It's a bit like a chess match, isn't it? With each side making calculated moves, trying to anticipate what the other will do next.
That's a great analogy. And just like in chess, every move has consequences. Take, for instance, the recapture of those two locations in the Kursk region. On the one hand, it's a strategic win for Russia, but on the other, it risks escalating the conflict and jeopardizing the ceasefire negotiations.
What about those disruptive groups that Russia has been using? What do you think of that tactic?
It's a really interesting approach. It suggests that they're trying to cause chaos behind enemy lines, disrupting operations. It's classic guerrilla warfare designed to sow uncertainty and fear.
And it seems to be working to some extent. We're seeing those reports of power outages and water supply disruptions in Sumy, indicating that those groups are hitting critical infrastructure.
Exactly. And that brings up another important point. This isn't just a conflict about land, it's also about resources and the ability to govern. By disrupting essential services, Russia is trying to weaken their opponent's control over the region.
This conflict has so many layers, and the stakes just keep getting higher. What should we be paying attention to in the coming days and weeks? What signs should we be looking for to understand where this is all headed?
Well, the outcome of these ceasefire talks is definitely going to be crucial. If they completely break down, we could see a huge escalation in the fighting.
Yeah.
We also need to watch the level of international involvement, particularly the type of support being provided to Ukraine. And of course, we need to keep an eye on the internal politics within both Russia and Ukraine, because that could have a big impact on how things unfold.
So much to keep track of. But it's so important to stay informed and to understand the complexities of this situation.
Absolutely. And that's what we're here for, to break it down and try to make sense of it all. Now, there's another aspect to all of this that I think we should discuss.
Okay, what's that?
It's the impact this is having on the people who actually live in these regions, the ones who are directly affected by this conflict. Now, we won't delve into specific personal stories, but I think it's important to just acknowledge the toll this is taking on them. Their lives have been completely upended, their homes damaged, their sense of security shattered.
It's a powerful reminder of the true cost of conflict, even if we can't put an exact number on it.
Exactly. And it's something we should all keep in mind as we try to understand and navigate this complex situation. We've covered a lot today. We looked at the territorial changes, the escalating attacks, even while there's talk of a ceasefire, the international community's response, and the tactical shifts being used by both sides.
It's been a fascinating and really thought-provoking look at an incredibly complex situation.
It has. And it's safe to say that things are still incredibly volatile and unpredictable.
It feels like we're standing on shaky ground. The stakes just seem to get higher and higher.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
I think the decisions that are made in the coming days and weeks could have really long-lasting consequences.
So what's the most important thing you want our listener to take away from this? What's the key takeaway?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is a multifaceted conflict. There are no easy solutions. We need to consider all the different viewpoints, stay informed, and be careful of narratives that oversimplify the situation.
That's such an important point, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information, but it's not always accurate or reliable. It really highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Absolutely. It's more important now than ever to be discerning about the information we consume and to question our own assumptions.
Yeah, it really highlights the fact that even with all the politics and all the strategy, there are real people whose lives are being completely turned upside down by this.
It really is a sobering thought, and one we shouldn't forget as we're trying to make sense of all this. So to recap, we've seen Russia retake some territory in the Kursk region that's changed things on the ground, and it's definitely gotten the attention of the global community. We've also seen both sides escalating the attacks, even while they're supposedly trying to work at a ceasefire.
Right. Which makes you wonder if a peaceful resolution is even possible.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have these unusual tactics like those disruptive groups that Russia's been using, it just adds another layer of unpredictability to this whole conflict.
It does. And all of this is happening while international alliances are shifting. And there's so much pressure on the leaders in both Russia and Ukraine. It's just a tangled mess of different factors that makes it almost impossible to predict what's going to happen next.
I agree, it's definitely complicated. But one thing's for sure, the decisions made in the next few days and weeks, both by those directly involved and by the international community, are going to have big consequences, not just for the region, but for the entire world.
So given all that, what should we be watching closely as this story continues to unfold?
Well, I think the ceasefire negotiations are key. If they fall apart completely, we could be in for a much bigger fight.
We also need to pay attention to how involved the international community stays, especially the support that's going to Ukraine. And of course, we can't forget about the internal politics in both Russia and Ukraine, because that could have a huge effect on where things go from here.
It's a lot to take in, but it really emphasizes how important it is to stay informed about what's going on and to have discussions about these events. Because in the end, the decisions that are made by everyone involved are going to shape the future of this region and beyond.
I think that's a good point. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in promoting peace and understanding, even if it's just staying aware and having respectful conversations.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to encourage you to keep learning about these issues, to question your own assumptions, and to look for different perspectives, because if we want to find a way towards a more peaceful future, we have to understand the complexities of this conflict. Knowledge is power, but it's most valuable when we use it to promote understanding and to try to make the world a better place.
That's a great point. Well, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll be back soon with more in-depth discussions of the most important issues facing us today.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.